Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming again today. And we're in our last sessions now of navigating the new norm in a post-pandemic world. And in the first two sessions, we covered what is happening, as well as the different situations that are surrounding working remotely, or also different things like the stimulus packages. And today we are back with our third session, which will be covering topics from force majeure to wills and estate livings as well too, and also passing on different properties. And so first, I would like to quickly introduce our moderator, Lee, who will be moderating for us, and she is the business owner and founder and principal of MORIN Entertainment Law, as well as our different speakers. Our different speakers today are Andrew Greenberg, Scott Willen, and Lorraine Funderburg. And we'll have Lee come on to introduce everybody.
What it's like with this new norm, returning to work with social distancing, sanitation practices that we've never had before, what it's going to be like as a working parent without any guarantee of childcare, and schools may be closing or they might be opening in your area. It's all over the place. States have really been kind of left to fend for themselves in this situation. So there's multiple different results in every area of the United States. And finally, we're going to talk about what may sound a little morbid, but is necessary for everyone who might be in life, and that is planning for the end of life. And I always say it's not safe to hope for the best without preparing for the worst. And as we have seen in the news, things can change in the blink of an eye. Without further ado, I'm Lee Morin. I'm an entertainment lawyer in Old Fourth Ward in downtown Atlanta. I'm very, very honored to be here tonight and to thank Ginger and Andrew for sharing this great idea with me. So happy. And Andrew is our panelist tonight, and he will be opening tonight's discussion. And we will also navigate to Scott, who is in LA on the West Coast, and he's our labor and employment expert, and he's going to talk about workplace fun. And finally, we're going to end the best with the last. Lorraine Funderburg is going to drill down on wills and estate planning. Fun stuff, you guys. So without further ado, I would love to introduce who really needs no introduction, because many of you already know Andrew Greenberg, Executive Director of Georgia Game Developers Association, 501c6 organization, so they do lobby and are very successful at lobbying the Georgia General Assembly for favorable legislation with regard to entertainment tax credits for interactive entertainment. So Andrew, let's start out tonight's talk about what the heck is happening in Congress, and are we going to get any stimulus legislation? What are your thoughts on heels versus heroes, or just what are your thoughts generally?
Yeah, I love all the pro wrestling jokes, having two bills, one called heels and one called heroes, with the joke being that we're going to end up with scrubs as a compromise. But that only makes sense if you're a goofy old wrestling fan like myself. So, yeah, we have had some stimulus measures already in place, and I think they're getting a lot of credit for having kept the economy running. Obviously, key things like PPP, the Payroll Protection Program, which has kept a lot of small businesses operating, not just operating, but also keeping their employees working. The EIDL, Economic Injury Disaster Loan Fund, the stimulus checks that many Americans got this year, and that big unemployment expansion to expand not just the amount of money people got, but also to expand the people who qualified for it, including a lot of contractors, folks who do art, and so forth. So we've had this in place, and there's a lot of concern that this is what has kept the economy running. And if we don't continue it, we're not in a position for the economy to come back right now. And without it, we will see a pretty significant crash. In the U.S., we have two major parties, Democrats and Republicans, who are very actively working on this topic, but their concerns are they're pretty far apart in what they want, what they believe is necessary to move forward. And we've already gotten to the point where the unemployment part of it expansion has run out for many Americans. So it's becoming very concerning, and a lot of businesses, and especially retailers, are concerned that they're going to be hit. There is a growing fear also of evictions and from landlords of tenants not being able to pay the rent, regardless of whether the rent is too darn high or not. And will the economy teeter as a result? So what I want to talk about are some of the main areas that the existing stimulus programs have impacted, and especially how they impact the kind of folks who will be involved on this call, folks who run studios, contractors, and the like, see where we are and see where we might be down the line. So one of the big expansions has been how the federal government handles unemployment. Now, unemployment is a state function. The states, like Georgia, set their own rate and say, this is how much you'll get for unemployment. And as a general rule, the amount you get for unemployment is supposed to allow you to survive, but it's not supposed to replace a job. In other words, you get enough to keep going until you find that job to actually prosper under. The fear with the pandemic has been that those jobs don't exist. We saw so many jobs disappear that there was no reason to just give people a substance amount, and instead we needed to give them enough that they could actually prosper, enough to keep the economy rolling on all cylinders. Usually you get enough to make the rent, buy food, pay your utilities, and maybe have a small amount of discretionary income left over. With the existing stimulus programs, we saw several expansions to unemployment. The two main ones I'll talk about are the $600 a week benefit, which was significantly more than Georgia gave, which was tacked on to what Georgia was already giving. And then we saw the expansion of who qualified. So normally you had to have been let go by your job and not for cause. If they fired you because you were stealing from the till, you weren't going to get any unemployment. While that still might be the case, they've expanded it to include people who did not have a single employer paying into the unemployment kitty on their behalf. Thus, yeah, people make the joke that we've got a bunch of Uber drivers receiving unemployment right now, but really there are a lot of contractors of all types whose work dried up and who found that they needed to go on the unemployment rolls, much to their own distress. But it was necessary for them to continue operating. So Scott, who's also on this call, hit me with a nice figure. I had been looking for exactly how many people were claiming this as gig employees, folks who would normally not qualify for unemployment. According to him, it's 413,000. Can you imagine that? 413,000 Americans who would otherwise be having no income but who now qualify and are getting unemployment. In addition, we're seeing 13 million people claiming this $600 a week expansion of unemployment. 13 million people at $600 a week. That's almost $8 billion pumped into the economy each week by the feds, and that makes a huge impact. So what the fear is right now is that it ran out at the end of July until Congress reauthorizes it. There's some thought from the executive branch it might be able to authorize it, but really money comes from Congress, so they have to be the ones to authorize this. A lot of discussions over how much people should get. Maybe it shouldn't be 600, maybe it should be 400, maybe it should be 200. But there's general agreement there needs to be more money in the fund than not. The thinking again being that the jobs just aren't there yet for us to want to push people out of unemployment. No reason we want to continue to pump money into the economy. One of the best ways is by giving these folks money that they can actually spend. So that's one of the big fears cropping up right now. Will that $600 run out? And then will we also be running out of the expansion for the gig workers, contract artists, musicians, contract coders, and the rest who might be having trouble finding work right now?
Now, Andrew, let me ask you, it seemed to me when I looked at the two bills side by side that HEROES was really more with an emphasis on the individual, whereas HEALS had more of an emphasis on businesses. Was that also your impression?
Well, certainly the Republicans would argue that businesses are a better way to get money into the hands of the individuals. On the other hand, there's no denying that the Democratic bill definitely covers more people, no matter how you slice it. The question is, which is the best use of the money? The stimulus money is a perfect example of that, and that was my next topic. Both groups want to cut another stimulus check to everybody, but the Democrats' proposal was almost 50% more than what the Republicans had proposed, and the amount of stimulus money that would go out. And who would get it was distinctly different. So many Americans got a stimulus check, probably helped a lot of folks over some humps over this in the past year. Another check right before Christmas would probably really spark the economy. Let me say, but right before the election, not right before Christmas. It'll be right before the election. Will spark a lot of people and make them happy going to the polls, and then later in the year. And it's very interesting to see both parties agreeing on this idea. Just throw the money out there and let people spend it regardless of qualifications or not. As long as you paid your taxes in the past few years, you'll be going ahead and getting this this check. But again, if the deal's not cut, we won't see any of this, and it might end up being a lean Christmas for a lot of folks. One of the areas that is covered in the law but doesn't get enough attention, or gets covered by payers but doesn't get enough attention, is the amount of money that's gone to states and local governments. So the federal government has distributed a significant amount of money already to places like Georgia, and then Georgia has spread that money out to the counties, DeKalb, Fulton, Cobb, et cetera, and then they've spread it around locally. So, for instance, Fulton County has given a lot of PPP gear to residents of the county, especially in South Fulton, where they've felt there have been greater shortages of such necessities. In DeKalb County, there's been PPP gear given out. The county's paid for a lot of testing sites that otherwise could not have paid for, and it's given away turkeys, I think turkeys and chickens, basically trying to deal with the food scarcity that people are afraid of. Food uncertainty has been a big part of the recent debate. The Democrats are trying to extend food stamps as part of this, which is part of why their bill covers more people. They've been very adamant about that point, actually. And it's true that a lot of folks are really worrying where their food is going to come from. And it's been fascinating seeing local governments giving out food to people, enough food to keep them going for at least a week. So those sorts of immediate shots in the arm for localities have been important, and we've seen it get spread around in a lot of different ways. And this is another place where the two bills are far apart, but I think we'll see another big distribution coming out to the states. Of course, there might be no eventual deal, but it looks like these are some of the things that are being discussed and have a lot of support, especially since there are a lot of Republican governors who would be able to give away this sort of aid. One area that's not in the bills that we need to touch on is insurance indemnification. And this might be one of the key sticking parts about this bill. We saw it become a major issue in the Georgia legislature when it reconvened this year. And that's the idea that businesses may not reopen for fear of being sued if people get COVID when they go there. And they're asking to be indemnified if they follow proper procedures. And it's very interesting watching the discussions go on both here in Georgia and nationally on what that appropriate level is. How should they be indemnified? And you lawyers will love the hair splitting on this one. What level of not just cleanliness, but attention to detail do they have to do? It's almost like preponderance of evidence versus overwhelming guilt. What level does the business have to prove in order to avoid being sued?
I would like to interject something here, if I may, with regard to the mask wearing, because some businesses have openly stated they would have a mask wearing policy, but then refuse to enforce it when confronted by their customers in the instance of other customers refusing to wear a mask. This is obviously a very big issue if you're going to put out there that, you know, you're inducing customers to come into your shop because you have a mask policy that you fail to enforce and verbally say, I am not enforcing, or whoever the manager is on duty. But That'll be a very interesting area to watch. Also, Professor Timothy Lighton from Georgia State made an interesting argument about this immunity when he talked about salmonella and said, listen, you could get salmonella. There's lots of salmonella cases every year, but you don't see people winning case after case for suing the restaurant for getting salmonella because it's so difficult to prove. And the same goes for COVID. It takes 14 days to 10 to 14 days to manifest. How hard would it be to actually prove one of these cases? And why is this such a major issue when you have similar situations with other illnesses?
Exactly. And the other part of the consideration that people point out is that a lot of folks who will catch it will probably not have been masked, will probably not maintain their own social distance. If you're in a grocery store, it's not going to be hard to find a point when they were within 6 foot of another person. You will find them touching things inappropriately, and it's an easy way to say you contributed to your own illness. On the other hand, there are definitely people who are saying it's an attempt to expand indemnification for business generally, to give them not just a precedent, but also a program they can then apply to other future issues in order to ensure that they have greater safety. On the other hand, you look at the studios, and there are studios that are still afraid of opening up because can you imagine if Tom Hanks caught COVID? Wait, he did. Can you imagine if a star did catch COVID and got sick on their set? And how will they have to pay off everybody involved in the movie when it gets canceled or loses 2 weeks of production for quarantine?
Well, we're already seeing lawsuits. The LA Times was reporting that employees, their families are already suing employers for employees like essential workers, warehouse workers who've gotten COVID. But Andrew, before we run out of time, I wanted to ask you to touch on universal basic income. Obviously, it's not just the United States that's been affected. The whole world has been affected. And UBI has been used in other localities, including in the state of Alaska, to some success. Is that a reality for the United States? If this whole debate in Congress doesn't get resolved, can we possibly be looking at a universal basic income to help us survive?
It's been very interesting to see the UBI discussions split between giving enough to actually live or just giving enough to add to your existing income level. And a lot of countries that have significant oil wealth have implemented some version of it. Saudi Arabia, obviously, there's a significant level of wealth generated as a result of it. The Alaskan example is a perfect example. They would get it from oil. They would get it from tourism. And, of course, when those industries collapse, then that might be tied up just when they need that sort of stimulus money the most. What the Alaskan examples and others often show is that providing this addition does not stop people from continuing to work like mad to improve their livelihood. What level it affects inflation, I think, is contested, and no one's really agreed to it. But when the funds are available, it seems to provide a significant level of cultural benefit and a real reason for people to move to Alaska in the first place. The discussion has never had as much attention and never been taken as seriously, certainly in the United States, as it is being taken now. And we will see that continue. It had started with automation, and the pandemic had kicked it into high gear. It's been very interesting watching people in the creative fields talk about this, because the general discussion is that creative jobs are the ones that will be the hardest to automate. So while truck driving and warehouse work and retail and the like all start being handled by computers, the creatives will still have a job. But the folks who get squeezed out of the market suddenly find themselves in need of income from somewhere, and who gives it to them? In my own Fading Suns game, Plug, the 4th edition is coming out. We actually postulate this as part of the collapse of the Second Republic, where folks were on this universal credit system. Folks got the money they needed to live, and when somebody messed up the computer and all the credit stopped flowing, things fell apart. Now, that's more predicated on the hacking side of it, but the idea that a civilization or country could could rely on some sort of payment like this is growing. And the important tie to this is that unemployment level. If the jobs are not there, how much do you give people? Do you give them a subsistence amount, or do you give them enough to prosper and have a significantly satisfying lifestyle?
But there's also a really strong nation argument as well. The taxes need to be more transparent, and entities that are taking advantage of favorable tax structures in other countries. For example, many companies in the United States take advantage of favorable tax structures outside of the United States. And that's the argument I know that the United Nations was making in one of the reports I read, that if we can create tax structures that are more transparent and more accountability, which, you know, in a perfect world, that's what my cynical mind is saying, then we could actually fund a universal basic income in a meaningful way to bring more equity to, you know, to close the gap, as it were, between those who are able to amass great wealth and hide it offshore versus those who are struggling to survive in this pandemic.
Are you trying to say we don't live in a perfect society and I can't keep 16 billion in Ireland?
Or the Cayman Islands, I don't know, you know.
That's true, but one of the other arguments that we see made is that it's just a refocus of the resources you have anyway, and who ends up benefiting the most? It's often going to be those companies who are going to be having people spending more money on their products. Those dollars will move around. So who will end up benefiting? Where will those dollars go? We talk about now that it's people like Bezos with Amazon, where everyone's spending their money anyway. It's very likely that's exactly how it would move in any case. The big question is there are still no really strong nationwide studies of anyone the size of the U.S. to make a good judgment on it.
I know that Canada has it, and they're just north of us. So, but it's a limited type of universal basic income.
But we talk about with the pandemic, but really it's automation that in many ways will be the driving stimulus to it. So we will see where that ends up.
So do you have any closing thoughts?
I do indeed. There are a lot of pages with information on tools our viewers can use, because what I didn't touch on was all the grant money going through different organizations. Decide to Cab, the organization I deal with, we're giving grants and interest-free loans to small businesses and census tracts with more than 20% poverty. And while most of our people probably won't qualify for that, there are a lot of other programs they can utilize. We're going to share some links in chat. I've given some, Lee's given some, that'll be valuable to a lot of our viewers if you've got small businesses to look into. What people are wanting right now is bridge money. They've gotten their PPP money, their EIDL money. It's running out now. The business is not back yet. Folks are still closed down. So we need these grants as bridge loans. I just wrote a reference letter to my barber trying to get one of these grants specifically because all those other funds are gone and they need something to bridge as they bring their place up to the standards they want, up and beyond what is required in order to get back to work. So look at these, especially if you're worried about what's going to happen until the next stimulus package passes, and see if you qualify for them. We'll share these in chat. Lots of valuable information. And I personally think that the stimulus, some sort of stimulus is going to come down the line. It will be significant, probably at least to the tune of a couple $1 trillion. And everybody will be seeing more money. I think that the unemployment funds will be backdated, so anyone who ran out at 7/31 will have a chance to get money in early August. Might not be that case, but very likely that's how they will authorize it. So keep your eyes peeled and check out these other grant programs and loan programs as you start trying to figure out what to do next. And thank you for the time, Lee.
Thank you for your expertise and insight. It was very, very, very helpful. Hopefully not too gloomy, a little optimistic. It never hurts to hope. That said, it's time to close our talk on the future stimulus legislation. Again, tomorrow is Congress's last day. Hopefully we'll get some news tomorrow, so keep your eyes on the news. And we're going to move into a discussion on workforce and labor with our expert in Los Angeles, Scott Whitland. And Scott, let's talk a little bit about the new norm and what people can expect to be changing and impacting them as they either return to the office with social distancing and new sanitation, or whether they have to stay at home, and what are states doing or unions doing, or is there any hope to have any type of childcare solutions? What are your thoughts on both situations right now?
Yeah, before we get there, I just want to jump in on the litigation because, we are tracking workplace COVID litigation on our firm's website. So if you go to I think the link for the web page is going to be there. We have a COVID resource page, and within the COVID resource page, we have what we're calling the COVID employment litigation tracker, which is a list that we actually curate. So it's not just every case that pops up. But there's, I think, over 220 or 230 cases that we've actually written a little summary of what the case is about. We've broken it down by type of case. Some people weren't paid when the economy shut down. Other people didn't get proper layoff notices. Other people were discriminated against because they had COVID. And so we've broken them down by about 6 or 8 different types of cases, broken them down by state. And so you can sort a whole bunch of ways and look to see what the trends are in that kind of litigation. So we're already seeing a lot of litigation, which is why a lot of companies are looking for some kind of immunity from litigation. And just to be devil's advocate for you guys, because you said, well, how hard can it be? Where's the risk? Because these cases are incredibly hard to prove. You have 14 days of incubation. You could have picked it up anywhere. If the cases are so hard to prove and they're not going to be very easy to prove, why not just save all the money on lawyers and grant immunity and take that off the table so you can encourage businesses to reopen? And I think that's the theory on business immunity. The Republican bill was a 1-year statute of limitations on claims, that the claims all had to go be in federal court, and that you had to have a non-treating physician verify, or opine on the claim, which are, a series of things. And then it had a standard, I think, of, something other than, splitting the hairs that Andrew was talking about. I think it was more than just a preponderance of evidence. I think you had to act in bad faith, or you had to disregard the public health ordinances, which can be very difficult to comply with. One of the things we're dealing with here, and now turning to what Lee really asked me about, so I feel like a politician. I answered the question I want to answer instead of the one that was asked. I think a lot of where you are today depends on where you are today. In places like Georgia, you guys are far more open than we are here in LA. Andrew, you have a barber. I was able to sneak in a trip to Supercuts about 4 or 5 weeks ago in that brief window where Los Angeles allowed us to have hair salons.
The hat looks good.
Yeah, it's like I'm getting puffy on the sides and stuff. And so I figured, it's a little bit light on top and Bozo the Clown on the side, so I needed a baseball cap. But we have a law office. We've got 40,000 square feet and 40 or 50 lawyers, and maybe 20 other office staff. We've got plenty of room. We could socially distance, and we can't open our office. And even with volunteers, we can't open our office in Los Angeles as much as we would like to, because right now the ordinances were shut down. Now, technically, we probably could open up for certain kinds of work because real estate work is allowed and things related to criminal law would be allowed. So we probably could get some people into the office, but we're not doing it. And other law firms, I gave a talk a couple of weeks ago to the the law office administrators for Los Angeles, and some of them aren't planning on opening till January 1st. And you can imagine the impact on the economy. The lawyers, there's been a lot of, talk about lawyers being furloughed, but you're talking about numbers in the dozens, maybe a few hundred, and lawyers taking pay cuts at big firms. But you have a lot of other people, administrative staff, you have messengers, you have translators, you have a whole host of people who are being impacted, who are hurt by the fact that law firms can't open. And so, we really need to get the economy moving and doing things in a safe way. And businesses are doing incredible work about trying to adopt policies and procedures to, to make the workplace as safe as possible, given that we're human beings and we communicate diseases.
What are some of the steps that you've noticed, Scott, people taking to make the businesses are taking to make those customers comfortable or employees comfortable? What are some of the things that you've been noticing?
Well, they're redesigning the workspaces. They're moving, work areas further apart from one another. One of the things we're doing is that, lawyers usually have offices with windows and our secretaries are outside our offices off on the hallway. We are moving all of our secretaries into offices. We've got enough office space so that no one will be sitting and working just out in the hallway. Obviously, masks are being required. They've gone to all touchless surfaces. So when you go up in a big office building, the doors getting into the building are those motion sensitive doors. They open up kind of like Star Trek and you walk in without having to touch the door. You get into the elevator. I don't know how they're doing the elevators in terms of whether or not they're going to have them stop at every floor or whatever. They're limiting them to 4 people per elevator car, which probably is not 6 feet, by the way, but they're telling, and the diagrams in LA, at least coming from the Department of Health, have everybody facing the corner. So you got one person in each corner of the elevator. So you kind of push your button and go. People have to wear masks when they're in public areas. Hand sanitizer stations all over the place. A lot of places have gone to directional routing through the office, so you can only go one way. You can't go back, kind of like the supermarket. Plexiglass where necessary. I was at my dentist's office, and by the way, medical real estate is probably the one safe area that may be, surviving the post-pandemic world, because a lot of people are just working remotely, and can continue to work remotely. And we'll talk about efficiency and other things like that. But you have to go to the dentist. You can't get your teeth cleaned or your root canal if you're sitting in your kitchen table. You have to go to your dentist's office. I was at my dentist's office. He's got new glass barriers between his reception desk and the billing area. They've got glass doors that he installed. They've got different kinds of vacuum areas to suck out the air from the patient areas. He's got an oxygen mask that he's going to wear while he works on people. So there's a lot of creative things that people are doing.
And they're taking your temperature every single second, right? When you walk in, it's that device right in your head.
Yeah, so a lot of workplaces are either doing hand scanners. Some of them are doing, area scanners where you can just scan people, and depending on how much traffic you get, they're able to pick out people who have more than 100.4 temperature, and talk to them about other things. Another thing we're doing, we have a questionnaire that you have to fill out every day saying that you don't have symptoms, that you don't have a temperature, you haven't been exposed to anybody, you haven't traveled outside the country in 14 days and things like that, and asking people to quarantine. And these are recommendations you can get from the Centers for Disease Control, the Occupational Health and Safety Administrator, and a lot of departments of public health. One of the problems we have in California is we've got a plethora of legal and governmental agencies, many with conflicting regulations. So if we are in the city of Los Angeles, where my office is, we are subject to the state regulation, the county regulation, and the city of Los Angeles' regulation. And, I think they want, the cure to cancer and the defunding of the police before they're going to let us come back to work. So it's it's very difficult in some places. But if you're in an essential industry, there's businesses that have been operating since the beginning. They never shut down. So we have clients in the food, manufacturing or distribution industries, people who are in medical supply industries, and they have been operating even though there's been this pandemic. And they have learned a lot, and a lot of these businesses are sharing their institutional knowledge about what they did and how they did things and what they've learned from it, so that other businesses can benefit and other people can benefit. And of course, there are industry trade groups. The Georgia Film Commission put together things for reopening the film industry in Georgia and the like. So now in unionized environments, there's other difficulties as well, because the unions want to weigh in, and sometimes it's because of legitimate concerns, and sometimes they have other interests. It's like in Los Angeles, I wasn't joking about defunding the police. The teachers union in Los Angeles is insisting that they won't go back to the schools to in-person teaching until the police are defunded. Not exactly sure how those two things relate, but that's what they're doing. So you can see that there's potential for mischief all around. But talking to employers, I can tell you that nobody wants to hurt somebody else. There's very few sociopaths out there who are actually looking to hurt coworkers or people that they've hired. They may have a greater or lesser degree of concern, but by and large, they're very concerned, and they don't want that guilt or responsibility that somebody's really going to get sick. So they're taking a lot of steps and affirmative steps and creating environments that they believe are safe.
Well, what if somebody does get sick at this point? Are there any benefits if they've already used their time allotment under FFCRA? Do they get any other opportunities, any other benefits, and where can they look for that coverage if they do get sick or someone in their family gets sick?
So you got to remember, so one of the things about the FFCRA, before we get to your question, is there was a case that was just decided, I think on Monday. It's a trial court case in federal court in New York. State of New York sued the Department of Labor over the FFCRA regulations. And it's created a lot of confusion because they were successful, the state of New York was, in invalidating, or at least in this judge's mind, invalidating three important components of the FFCRA. One of the things that the regulations that were adopted under this is the law that created the paid family leave and paid sick leave for pandemic related issues, was that people were out of work where there was work. So if your business shut down because they didn't have any work for you, you weren't entitled to paid leave for that, which makes sense because the business isn't getting any revenue, they're shut down. The judge disagreed with that, and through an interesting interpretation basically said that it wasn't necessarily so that you could only get the benefits if you were out of work where there was work. So that was one change. Two was the judge rejected the documentation requirements developed by the Department of Labor. And the third area of the regulations was he rejected the definition of healthcare provider. The law exempted healthcare providers from being entitled to this paid family leave, with the idea being that we need healthcare providers working to maintain the healthcare delivery system so that people can get their healthcare during the pandemic. And the Department of Labor basically developed a broad definition of healthcare provider, because it shouldn't just be the doctor, it would also be the nurse and the orderly and the people who maintain the ventilators and all of the equipment. And the judge said that was way too broad. So what we have now is this regulation that people were relying on that has been called into question, and employers are going, well, what do we do? How do we administer this law that we have no history with, that the Department of Labor gave us guidance on, and now this judge says the guidance is no good? Tell us what we need to do. And so the FFCRA is sort of in limbo. There's a variety of things that could happen. One is that in all probability, I think most people would say that if you're sick because you have COVID and you've previously exhausted your own paid sick leave or family medical leave, you still may be entitled to some disability accommodation. Now, that won't necessarily get you paid, but it would get you something else. And you may also be entitled to state disability benefits in your state, which are similar to, at least in California, very similar to unemployment insurance benefits. And so there is a safety net there.
So
And
is there also a safety net for childcare, perhaps? Because I know I was reading that some employers, like Kaiser Permanente out in California, for example, and other companies have been providing a stipend, even going so far as to just give money to employees to pay family members to come in and watch their kids while they're home from school. With schools being closed or uncertain whether they're going to open, if somebody gets COVID, then everybody has to quarantine, like we had in Gwinnett County with 240 teachers getting COVID in one day of planning, then what kind of access to benefits can people look for their children while they have to continue working from home and while their kids need stimulation and instruction?
well, it's very difficult. So first of all, Kaiser Permanente is an interesting example because while they're big enough to give that kind of benefit, they're not covered by the FFCRA. So Families First, oddly and uniquely, was only applicable to smaller employers, fewer than 500 employees. The large employers were completely exempted from the obligations of the FFCRA. And, at the time, the explanation that Nancy Pelosi gave is, we expect them to be doing this anyway. We don't need a law, which is the first time I've ever heard the government say that. Well, we just expect you to do it, so there's no need to have a law requiring you to do this. Number one. So, bigger companies are sort of off on noblesse oblige. It's going to be, what they think they need to do to be right. The childcare issue for school is a big one because most of the spring, I think people just wrote off the spring. They figured, okay, school is school. We're going to be out. No, kids really aren't going to learn very much. There's nothing we can do. It's at the last minute. And so depending on the school district, it went from being pretty good remote learning to completely non-existent. I had a workman at my house today who was repairing something, and I was talking to him about it. He's got two kids, one is 6 and one is 9. And he said the one who's, or 11 or something, he said the one who was in 5th grade was, he said, my kid is not a great learner. He's not dumb. He just doesn't grasp things without a lot of effort. And he said, during the spring, his teacher was available for a 15-minute Zoom call once a week. And he said, and my kid never came to me for help with homework. I think I've shared the story about my niece who is in 9th grade, and she had a number of teachers, and they had different levels of effort. But one of her teachers, I think her government teacher or history teacher, gave them one assignment right before the school shut down, and it was posted to the website, and then 6 weeks later updated it. And that was the total of remote learning for that one class.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure. Oh, I'm sorry.
Other people have had, much better experiences where the school is, in session, for 4 or 5 hours a day. And the problem they have is, keeping their kids focused, because if your kid is 7 or 9 or 10, it's hard to get them to focus consistently without somebody there to mime them, to tell them not to go wander off from the computer. It's a big struggle. And the studies have shown that about 60% of the parents who are working from home are having a hard time balancing the work, childcare, obligations that they have.
So are there any incentives, I guess is what I'm wondering, for anyone who does have kids who is working from home, that should they be looking to their employer? Should they be looking to the state? Where can they look for access to some funding, if there's any at all, what resources can they look to help manage that problem of having to do double duty and not doing so great at it?
There is no help right now. I haven't seen any real help, and that's why so many people think it's so important to get schools open.
I know in Georgia, our schools are open. We were seeing photos of like Paulding County and other schools, and they're just kids en masse, no mask. And Lorraine is nodding her head. So yeah, I mean, in Georgia, we're completely open.
Look at Europe, the experience in Europe is very similar to that. A lot of school districts are doing a lot more, but in Europe, they didn't distance the kids. They didn't mostly of Europe, it didn't require them to have masks, and they didn't have the disasters that the teachers' unions have been predicting. And that's why people are saying it's probably safe to keep the schools open, particularly for kids under 10, because they have had the best health outcomes. They're getting sick. They're getting diagnosed with COVID, but they get over it very quickly, most of them. I just saw a statistic on the news that the total number of deaths of children under 17 or something is 0.1% of all of the COVID deaths. They represent about 8% of the cases and 0.1% of the deaths. So the risk of this disease to them, much less than like influenza, where they have, a lot worse outcomes with the flu. But, there's a whole host of bad outcomes for kids when they're not in school. They're not getting their education. They're not getting socialized. They talk about child abuse, which I think is sort of a red herring. It's a bad problem, but it shouldn't be that the schools are the place to catch it, but they do catch it there. For very poor kids, a lot of times it's their only source of nutrition throughout the day. There's a whole host of social benefits that schools provide that you could do in other ways without the instruction. But the instruction part doesn't seem to be, it's something that can't be overcome. A lot of schools are staggering the days. They're stretching out the school day. So some kids are in school early, some are in the middle of the day. The older kids are in the later part of the day. They're teaching in pods, so there's smaller, arrangements. They're not exposing the kids to multiple teachers and the teachers to multiple groups of kids, so that the cross-contamination risks are smaller and they can contain that stuff. They're spreading out the schools. They're doing instruction outside where the weather is nice. Can't do that in Michigan in January, but you can do it in Georgia in October. It's probably quite nice. But there are things they can do to make things better. And they can, do it in a combination with remote learning as well. I know some school districts are doing like Monday, Wednesday, and every other Friday for some kids, and Tuesday, Thursday, and the other Friday for the other kids. So there's combinations of things that they can do, and that, the more school districts that are doing that will help. But the employers, particularly a small employer, what are you going to do? If you've got 100 employees, you can give them a little bit of a grant, but you're probably struggling as well.
And I think that was the argument essentially was, if you're going to either have childcare in-house or, some companies do that, or you're going to pay a small amount, even if it's just $100 a week, maybe that is a lot depending on how many employees you have with children. But yes, hopefully we will find out as time goes by what the best solution is. We are out of time for the discussion on workforce, but Scott, if you have any final statements, I would love to hear them now for our audience members as they navigate this new norm, either in the workplace or at home. Any final thoughts?
Yeah, very quickly, there's a lot of literature coming out now about all of these things and about the idea of remote work, which everybody seemed to think was a huge success right off the bat. And I think it was generally. But, as things get more close to how they were normally and the rest of businesses open up, there's going to be more distractions at the workplace. And there's also going to be more isolation, and you lose some of the esprit de corps and teamwork that you get by working in groups. And there's a lot of people who are studying the impact of all of that. And I think this is going to be an interesting next 5 years as things develop, because basically we took something that was possible, but sort of 10 or 15 years off on the horizon, and telescoped it into a 3-month period. And now people are trying to, work through what does it all mean. And I think you'll see a lot more remote work, but probably less than what we have right now. So.
Yeah, no handshakes, right? No hugs. And that will have an impact certainly on a mental and emotional health as well. But thank you so much for those comments and all of your insights, Scott. Very much appreciated. And we are now going to navigate into the final session of the evening with Lorraine Funderburg in Atlanta, Georgia. She is our wills and estate planning expert and also has an intellectual property practice. Welcome tonight, Lorraine, and tell us all about what it is you do with intellectual property and how that vision tailors into your wills and estate planning practice. Oh,
Lorraine, I think you have to unmute.
I think Lorraine's volume is, at the moment, we can't hear her. She is muted, so she's going to unmute her screen, and then we will be able to hear her. Let's see here.
She is unmuted.
She is unmuted.
So just for some reason, her mic isn't picking her up now, whereas earlier she sounded crystal clear.
She did. She sounded crystal clear. So we're going to pause just for a moment and have some elevator music equivalent while we figure out Lorraine's volume control issue. Lorraine, can you refresh your screen? Maybe that'll help.
And I'll take this moment to plug the GGDA's own Back to Work guidelines. You can find at www.ggda.org. Sure, as we wait.
Can you hear me now?
Yay!
Right. Okay.
We will definitely come back at the end of our evening and give you guys all of the good links, of course. But we're definitely going to take advantage of Lorraine's working microphone to dive into her discussion that she's prepared for us tonight. So Lorraine, without further ado, please proceed.
Yes. Well, hello, everyone, and thank you so much for having me here tonight. It is definitely an honor to be here with you guys. So, yes, I am a trademark and copyright attorney, and I also do estate planning. I do entity formation. So our motto at my firm, Funderburg Law, is create the business, protect the brand, build the legacy, right? So that involves the entity formation, protecting, your personal liability by forming business, then contracts to protect your business, then definitely protecting your brand and your brand assets with copyrights and trademarks, and then building out that legacy and making sure you're monetizing off of those brand assets that you have protected. So there is very much an intersection between, intellectual property and estate planning because it is an asset. Intellectual property is property. It's, the property of one's intellect, your creations. So it's very important that everyone, creatives definitely for sure, make sure that they are on top of the ownership of the things that they create and that they have a proper legal trail for those things that they've created so that when something happens, they can determine how those things are distributed. So I've always been very much interested in that intersection between intellectual property and estate planning because surprisingly, a lot of people in the industry, and I do mainly music law, they just don't even think about that type of thing, estate planning at all, which I'm always like, you're creating all of these things. How are you not thinking about what's going to happen to them, once you die? Because the protection does not end at death. So yes, I want to go over just a few things with you guys. Estate planning, like I said, that's something that I do. And estate planning is, the process of pretty much deciding who gets what, when, and how upon death or incapacitation. So you're going to be dealing with different legal documents that you execute that include instructions for passing along your tangible assets and also your intangible values, such as, religion, education, hard work, ethic, any of those things. And it also includes instructions for your care if you don't die but become disabled and you're just unable to, make those types of decisions for yourself. Also, I won't get into this too much because I'm not a tax professional and I like to stay in my lane, but definitely having a properly drafted estate plan will help you to minimize taxes and other costs like court costs and unnecessary legal fees. There are a number of different types of estate planning tools. Your major ones, as far as like having a complete estate plan, will be your last will and testament, a living trust, which could be revocable or non-revocable, an advanced medical directive, which includes your durable power of attorney for health care and also your living will, and then also your financial power of attorney, which could be durable or springing. So,
and tell us what that means, durable, for audience members who don't speak legalese.
Oh, yes. So, yes, I was going to get into all of that. But since you asked the question, the durable power of attorney for the finances means that that power exists at the moment of creation, right? So your financial power of attorney is basically when you appoint somebody else to act as you to handle financial transactions, whether it be selling your house, handling, writing checks, handling banking transactions, pretty much acting as you would when it comes to your finances. And so the difference between a durable power of attorney for finances and a springing power of attorney is that when you draft a durable financial power of attorney, that power exists with the person you have appointed presently as soon as you execute it. But the springing power exists once you are incapacitated and are no longer able to act in your own stead for your financial, for all of your finances. And so sometimes, people, you have the financial power of attorney because you definitely want to have somebody to act in your place, should something happen, but you don't want them to do that right now, right? And so that's why you would make it a springing power of attorney. But if, it's your spouse or, you're an elderly person and you have a niece or a nephew or even your child who does handle financial transactions for you while you're still living, then you may want to have a durable power of attorney in that case. So your last will and testament, that's one that most people are familiar with, and it's usually the estate planning tool that everyone stops at. I always tell people that that's like an estate planning tool of last resort. You definitely want to have a will, but it's not, the only estate planning tool that you want to implement. So your will is basically, the document that says who gets what when, right? And you do need to have a will if you have minor children. It becomes very important in that case because you can appoint a guardian for your children when you have a will. Hold on one second. Preston, I need you to quiet down, please. I'm sorry. I have minor children. Yes. So yeah, your last will and testament, like I said, is going to allow you to say who gets what when in that case. Your living trust, and those can be revocable or non-revocable. And revocable means that you as the settlor, the person who creates the trust, can revoke this trust. So if you decided you didn't want it to exist anymore, you could decide it doesn't exist anymore. But if you create a non-revocable trust, you are not allowed to revoke that trust. Whatever it is that you determine in that trust, as far as your beneficiaries and distributing those assets, it just stands unless you receive permission from all the beneficiaries of the trust that they will end the trust. Then that's the way to terminate a non-revocable trust. But a living trust is something that, because your last will and testament, Preston, be quiet, please. Sorry. Your revocable, your living trust is something that you would want to have as like a will substitute, right? Because your last will and testament, your goal of having estate planning really is to avoid probate, right? And so, because probate is really like getting sued when you're dead, and nobody wants to be sued ever. You definitely don't want to be sued when you're dead. So you want to avoid probate altogether. But if you have a will, your will is going to be probated. It goes through probate court. It has to go through the court to determine that, everything is, all of your assets and everything are distributed in accordance with your will. But a living trust is an outside document that does not go through probate, right? And so it's its own living entity. You put assets into that trust and it's just distributed. And because it's a living trust, it can exist for a while after you die, right? So with your last will and testament, if you have minor children, they're not allowed to own over a certain amount of property, and it will vary by state. So probate law and estate planning is something that's all very state specific. And so different states have different rules about how much property a minor can own. But, for most states, it's not very much, right? So you don't want to have something happen to you right now and you have a 3-year-old that you've left all of your assets to, because they're not going to be able to own any of those assets if it's, over a certain amount of money. And so what'll happen is that state law kicks in, right? It's almost like dying without a will. And I'll get into that piece in just a second. But whenever there's no will or there's no estate plan in place, then the state law is going to govern exactly what's going to happen. And when you have left assets to minor children who are not permitted to own over a certain amount of property, then you're kind of at the state's mercy. You have to deal with the Uniform Minors tax trust laws, and they may hold the assets for your child until your child becomes of, the age of majority. And you may want them to have those assets during the period of their lifetime. And so the living trust is a document that's living, breathing, and lasts beyond your death. And it allows you to say, hey, if I have a 5-year-old when I pass, I'm going to appoint a trustee, which is somebody who is going to manage these assets that I have, and say, hey, I want you to make sure that they go to these types of schools, or that they receive this type of stipend, or this type of money until they get to be, the age of 25, for an example. And then at that point in time, I would want them to have the rest of my assets. And that becomes important, if you have not only just minor children, but children who are, or other people that you care for that are disabled or just irresponsible with money, right? You just wouldn't want to leave them any types of lump sums. So your living trust will help with that. The other thing is with the living trust is it's its own entity, right? And so you want to avoid estate taxes and things like that. And so anything that is in your living trust is not part of your actual estate. It's a separate entity. It lives outside of you, so it won't be able to be taxed in the same way that any of your other assets are when you pass. And so your advanced medical directive is some states combine them. Georgia does, right? So Georgia has your advanced medical directive, which really combines your durable power of attorney for healthcare and your living will, which are pretty much like instructions for like end of life instructions. If you were to be in a position where you were incapacitated and probably weren't going to live. Like, do you want to receive food, or liquids through a tube? Or do you want to just have your death naturally occur? Or would you want, everything, would you want to stay on a machine even though you weren't possibly going to live, for the inevitable future? It's those types of things. Like, how would you want your death plans to work out? As far as the healthcare proxy, that is basically like a power of attorney where you're appointing somebody else to make decisions for you, but medical decisions for you in the event that you are unable to make them yourself.
I have a question. So under the current COVID situation, if I was on a ventilator, would that be incapacitated, or what stage does incapacitation register?
Yeah, so incapacitation definitely occurs when you are just unable to communicate your own wishes for you at that point. So yes, being on a ventilator, if you are unable to speak, communicate, and say what it is that you would want to happen to you, then that is when, your healthcare proxy or your living will would kick in. So the advanced medical directive. And so that was one of the things that, like, once COVID hit, I was I was doing a lot trying to educate people about, estate planning. Just because it's one of those things that I find is overlooked by a lot of us. Most people think that, it's reserved for the very wealthy or for the people who are just, on their deathbed. But the sad part about it is, like, once you're on your deathbed, you're not able to make any of those decisions. So it's definitely advisable to have this type of plan put into place and worked out. And, having those conversations with the people who you are appointing to be in those positions, so that even if it is, you've given somebody the medical power of attorney, that they know what you would want to happen in those types of situations, for sure. There's also something known as intestate succession, and that is basically when you die without an estate plan. So you don't have a will, you don't have a trust, you don't have any of those things in place, and then your property and everything that you own is going to pass by intestate succession, and that is according to your state law. And generally, it's where the states have all of their intestacy laws in place, and they're pretty much designed to distribute property the way in which they think, that an average person would have drafted their estate plan. Most states have adopted what is known as the Uniform Probate Code as either like the exact laws for how they determine their distributions, or, just kind of as a guide for the basis of their intestate laws. Here in Georgia, intestate succession works. So if you were to die without a will, with your assets, and say you had a spouse and some children, it would be split equally amongst them. They do have a rule where your spouse is at least, if you had like 5 kids and a spouse, like your spouse is at least supposed to receive 1/3 of your estate. And then the rest would be split equally among your children. If you don't have a spouse, then everything would just be split equally amongst your children. And then grandchildren, right? So there's something called per stirpes versus per capita, and that's just distribution rules, right? And Georgia goes by per stirpes. And that means that the descendants of somebody who dies will step in the place of the heir that would have shared in the estate if they hadn't died, right? So if you have children and you had 4 children, for an example, but one of those children died but had kids, so those kids would step in and receive the share that child would have received, and share equally with the other children of that same generation. Per representation, and there are other states that go by that pretty much means that if an heir is deceased, then that person just doesn't share in it at all, even if they had children. It means that, like, everyone who's of that same lineal descent, of that same lineal heritage would just split all of those assets equally, and then those grandchildren, unfortunately, or wherever they were on the line, wouldn't share in the estate. It would just be split equally between the children. So Georgia goes like spouse and children, and then our children and the grandchildren. If there are no children or grandchildren, then it goes to the parents and their children. So that would be, your siblings. And if your parents or your siblings are deceased, then it goes next to the grandparents and their children, which would be your aunts and uncles.
How does this all factor in if I was a creative with intellectual property? What happens to my copyright? What happens to my assets?
Yeah, so as far as intellectual property is concerned, it is treated almost as like, your personal property. It's one of your assets. So if you were to pass, and under Georgia law, if you were to pass, then, and you had a spouse and your children, then they would actually share equally in this intellectual property. If you didn't have any spouse and you just had children, then it would pass down to your children. So it goes in the same way that it's just treated as one of your assets. Intellectual property is definitely, it is an asset of the individual who owns it. And so it would be treated in the same way as other property.
So what if I don't own my intellectual property? Because as you know, copyright, a lot of the time with games, especially since they're audiovisual works, you might be creating intellectual property under a work made for hire. Or maybe it's an assignment. Those are so explain the difference of the two types of transfers and why and how I might expect if I was if I have assigned my rights over versus I did my creative work under a work made for hire. Can my family or my descendants expect any proceeds from that? How does that shake out?
So it's really going to be based on, you know, the contractual obligations that you had, right? So if we're talking about work made for hires and you had transferred those rights over, there's a difference. So copyright under an individual lasts for, you know, the life of the author plus 70 years, right? But when you're dealing with the work made for hire, the copyright doesn't actually belong to the person who creates it. It belongs to the person who you have assigned it to under that work made for hire. And they hold it for 90 years or 120 years beyond publication. And so normally when you have that work for hire relationship, there has to be a contract, or else you wouldn't be able to transfer those rights. Copyright's very specific as far as that is concerned, where you cannot transfer those rights from the originator of who actually created the work to somebody else without actually having a writing. So the contract itself is going to dictate how those assets, or at least the profits and proceeds from those assets, are distributed. So if you created a work and transferred it based on work made for hire or assignment, there is a contractual agreement that determines how you were getting paid based off of that transfer of rights. And those rights would then still transfer to, you know, the estate and pass along to them based on who was receiving it, either if they had the estate plan or if they died by intestate succession.
So for example, if I knew my mom or dad made a movie, was an animator, and might have gotten some proceeds on the back end, maybe a profit participation in a creative project, or, you know, similarly with a game, if I had some type of expectation for contingent income, I might want to talk to the owner of that copyright, right? The company
Yes.
or the publisher, and say, hey, what can I expect? You know, because a lot of the time this stuff is documented by the company, right? And
Right.
very rarely do we find copies of these documents in our parents' piles of paper that we have to go through when they die.
Yeah, unfortunately.
So, but talk a little bit about the assignment as a distinction. And I'm sorry to have to make this our last little bit, but we have to get to Q&A. But why is the assignment really, really important for the children and the descendants of creatives? And I'm thinking of Stan Lee's kids as an example. But why is the assignment important? Because of talk about termination.
Right, because there are termination rights when you do have an assignment. So when you do assign a copyright to somebody else, that's not you giving over your copyright for the life of the copyright, right? And so there are some termination rights that you would have to invoke and fill those out with the Copyright Office and also with the person who you assigned those rights to, so that those rights would then be transferred back to you, so that the copyright is also transferred back to you, so that then you would own the copyright moving forward once you have returned that assignment right back over. And then you would be able to receive all of the proceeds and everything that came along with the ownership of the copyright, because at that point you would own it.
And then you can license it back out or do whatever you want with it if you're the owner. But the key here being the number of years you have to wait.
Yeah.
And so if you're creating intellectual property right now that's copyright registrable, it's 35 years is that window from when you assign those rights, when you can finally get that second bite at the apple. So that's a full generation of people right there. So, you know, right now we're seeing a lot of termination notices filed for assignments that were created in the 1980s. So it's going to be a while. But the bottom line is protect your assets, right, Lorraine?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And definitely maintain that paper trail. And like you said, you know, a lot of times the companies are the ones who actually have the contracts, but you signed them. You should always have a copy of them, and you should always maintain at least, and I know when I do this with all of my estate planning clients, like who actually do the process of estate planning, I gather all of these documents, not just your estate plans, but, you know, birth certificates, marriage certificates, death certificates, you know, everything. Put it in a box, write a letter, you know, let's attach that to your estate plan. Let somebody else know that you have done this work, that it exists in this place, in this location, so that somebody knows where to go to find all of these things if and when, you know, you pass.
Right. Like maybe a safety deposit box or something, you know. So unfortunately, we're out of time. We could probably go on for a much longer time on end of life planning, because there, as you can see, are so many elements that go into it, and you definitely want to hire a lawyer who's licensed in your state, because as Lorraine was saying, this is a very state specific inquiry. So definitely, you know, sooner than later, let's all hope that is each of our cases.
Right.
And without further ado, Ginger and Andrew, Ginger, are there any questions from the audience that we might be able to answer tonight? Y'all feel free to type in the chat. Is he asking what the risk is? Is that
It's a
Joe
medical, it's a
Hasselhoff?
medical question, I think.
Hi, Joe.
She's like, I know exactly who that is.
So are there, well, thank you, Joe. Are there any other questions that our audience members have for our panel of experts? We have legislative experts. We have labor and employment experts, wills, estates and trusts, intellectual property experts, experts of all kinds. So I would love to answer this because I just drafted one with all the new language. So I have videographers that I represent, and commercials are very busy right now, right? Think about why that is. Very short shooting times, very short production, you know, small crews, more or less, you know, for most of it. And so they're really busy and they need contracts for their jobs. So I'm drafting now new language in these clauses with regard to the force majeure, which is sort of the act of God, basically anything beyond your control, right? You can control certain things like showing up for work, having all your equipment, things like that, but you can't control a strike, you can't control floods, etc. And so what we also inserted is quarantine restrictions. You know, so these stay-at-home orders and shelters in place. So we inserted that language. We also inserted language on safety and health that we had inserted before. So an entire paragraph on OSHA and safe sets and all this other language, because when you're dealing with a contract situation, you have to be very, very clear about who's responsible for safe sets, who's responsible for those health and safety precautions. And a lot of the time, the person hiring the contractor is going to be responsible for example, informing the contractor of a hazardous situation, if there's an environmental risk, if there's a chemical risk or a physical risk. So they have to inform you, but the contractor typically will assume the responsibility for keeping their workers safe and making sure that they have workers' compensation that will kick in if anybody gets hurt during the job. So these safety and health precautions certainly are now reflecting, like Scott was saying earlier, the patchwork of regulations that are coming up. So we can't really state with specificity which set of regulations. So what we basically say is the relevant, the applicable regulations, some type of language where it is a flexible clause. So it does highlight what we're generally aiming for, but certainly it's important to have insurance, premises insurance if you're working on location, bodily injury coverage, and other types of relevant insurance if you're going to be working on a site, especially if you're capturing footage and the like. You guys work in an office, I would imagine, not too much on-site work. unless you're doing mocap, right? And with game developers, Andrew, I'm not sure there's much risk with being in somebody else's office per se.
Well, remember that we have a lot of bullpen areas. You've got play testing areas where you want to have strangers in. You'll have people testing in close quarters. You often have VO areas who are telling VO folks to bring their own pop screens if they don't even bring their own microphones. For companies to send out standards for people who want to bring in their own laptops, microphones, headsets, etc., to know what they need in order to plug in, USB or whatever. So yeah, there's a lot of details that are going into it.
Yeah, and if you remember, I may have mentioned this on the last presentation. I had a client that was looking to do some stunt work for either cinematics or for some mocap, and they were scouring the globe trying to figure out where they could actually record. They wanted to record up in the Bay Area with some stunt performers from LA, and so they had some issues about how they were going to get the performers from LA to the Bay Area. And it's probably the middle of June, and I was suggesting not a whole lot can go on because you can't really record in the area, and you can't record in LA because they're not allowing it. But Georgia is opening up, and you may want to look at Georgia. But if you think about what goes on a performance capture or mocap stage, this was stunts. There was some fighting going on. It was a lot of interpersonal activity where you're not socially distanced. And that's, sort of true whether or not you're doing, live action, game development, or even, mocap for animation.
Actually, I was just listening to the showrunner from Grey's Anatomy on a podcast last week talk about shooting scenes of intimacy and using CGI, doing interesting edits. So there's a lot of substitution now in creative ways of capturing footage. I'm assuming with games it's the same, like you said, with mocap, having to come up with creative solutions. Are there any
the intimacy coordinators are going to be looking for work for a long time?
Safe sets.
Yeah, I was concerned. I was wondering about the safe sets or safe sex comment. I wasn't exactly sure.
Safe sets with a T as in Tom. Geez. So are there any other questions from our audience that they want to talk about future waves, possible future legislation, anything from our listeners? Oh, yes. What creates the legally enforceable will in Georgia? Lorraine, do we have to have a witness?
Cut out the lawyer.
So I was going to say holographic wills, which are the ones that you're just scribbling and writing, are only effective if you're on your deathbed. Like, otherwise, that doesn't work. So in order to have a validly legal will in Georgia, it needs to be typed up. It needs to be witnessed by two people who are over the age of 18 and who are non-beneficiaries under the will, for sure. And you have to have mental capacity when you're drafting it. So you have to be in your right mind in order to determine, who gets what when. So yeah, the written will on a napkin is only going to work if you're in the hospital about to croak.
I would say tape that, videotape that, just so you don't have to litigate whether or not you were in your right frame of mind, right? Yeah. Because that, I'm sure, is
that
a highly...
comes up a lot, in capacity. Always how people are trying to contest wills all the time, so yeah.
This is the 21st century, live stream it.
Right, Facebook Live. So you guys want to go into our announcements since we're coming down to that 30 minutes milestone. Ginger and Andrew, did you have announcements for your groups?
Yeah, absolutely. We will be having a GGDA meeting in a couple of weeks. I'll be making the announcement more public soon, but one of the things we'll be doing is talking about the future course of the GGDA. Since we're expanding to include live streamers and esports competitors, we'll be doing focus groups with members on some of the areas we're looking to go into. So I will send out information, and we'd love to have all the members' feedback on the kind of things we're up to. In addition, the GGDA will be active at Virtual Dragon Con and at the Virtual Decatur Book Festival. So get ready to be involved with these events as well. And we are making plans right now for the Siege Investment Conference and perhaps more. So more updates coming. Yeah, that's a big part of why I was talking about these grants for bridges between stimulus packages. There's a lot of fear that that might happen, and even businesses that are reopening are not guaranteed success. So look into all of these various bridge loans. Don't take it for granted that we're on an upswing now. Be ready. As Lee said, plan for the best, but prepare for the worst.
Absolutely. I'm going to start using that.
Never. Oh, go ahead.
Well, so currently, so if you're an employee, you're most likely going to be covered by workers' compensation. And workers' compensation doesn't require negligence. The standard for coverage under workers' compensation is if the injury, or in this case, the illness, arose out of employment and occurred during the course of employment. If you think about the typical industrial injury, it's not very hard to establish those issues, although those issues get litigated all the time. But you don't have to prove that there was a standard of care that was violated, just that you got hurt. What some states, California, Illinois being the two most prominent, have done is take away the question of whether or not the injury happened in the course of employment, and said that there's a presumption that if somebody is working for you and they get sick, it's presumed that they got sick while they were working for you. And then it's a rebuttable presumption so that the employer can prove the negative. No, they didn't get sick while they were working for me. They got sick somewhere else, which is a very high burden for the employer. For third parties, if they're a customer, if they're a vendor, then they are in the tort system, and then normally would have to prove negligence. And it's like anything else. If you think about the car accident, a lot of these things are he said, she said, and you've got to sort of prove through inference or witnesses how that happened. And, the mere fact that I was negligent doesn't necessarily prove that my negligence caused your injury. And, it's really a question of where do you want to stick the liability? Somebody's going to have to pay, right? Because somebody gets sick, somebody's going to have to pay for the medical bills. Is it the employer, the person's employer through insurance, or the health insurance companies, or the emergency room, or where is that cost to society going to get stuck? But, if you think somebody is behaving badly, maybe they're not having masks. Although, one of the things with masks, and Lee, when you brought this up earlier, it occurred to me, masks are not for everyone. There are people with medical conditions where they can't wear masks. And so let's say you run a retail store and you have a mask rule, and somebody comes in and they say, I can't wear a mask. Or let's say, they're an airline and airlines are requiring masks. And they say, I can't wear masks. I have this respiratory condition and I'll die if I wear a mask. Well, the airlines are refusing to allow those people to board. I think that's an ADA violation, quite frankly, because, there's issues about, you have to accommodate people, and how do you make those accommodations? And some of it is they want to have you have to delegate down to some employee who probably isn't medically qualified to make the determination as to whether or not this person is appropriate to have an exception to the mask rule.
Can they get an oxygen tank, their own custom-made oxygen mask?
Who knows? That would be the accommodation, that you give them a tank, that instead of a cloth mask, you're having them breathe through some kind of respirator for, air assist, or you let them wear a face shield. One of the weird rules in many states, in California as well, is that they're saying that deaf people don't need to wear masks because it interferes with their ability to communicate. And my view is it's not the deaf person who can't wear a mask because they have to read lips. It's everybody else that they're talking to. And so I don't know why the deaf people would be from the mask requirement, but the people that they need to communicate with might need to wear a mask.
I have
Very
actually
interesting.
I've seen, Ginger, have you seen these clear masks that,
Yeah, it's the same thing without wearing the mask, right? It's almost the same thing. It's, these are, I don't think a lot of the rules have been created, have been really well thought through on some of these issues. And, from an employer standpoint, it's difficult because you're trying to administer a workplace, you're trying to administer things fairly, you're trying to communicate to everyone, and, you also have a duty of privacy not to communicate to a particular person's health conditions to everybody else in the workplace. And so how do you balance all of that? It tends to create nightmares for people. But
well, maybe we'll find out in the next 6 months and we can all reconvene next year for another session of the post-pandemic world panel. But we'll have to think of a new title because it won't be a new norm at that point, right? It'll be a norm. So we'll be back next year.
Norm.
I just want to, before we end our video, thank our speakers tonight. You guys have been great. Thank you, Lorraine. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Andrew. And thank you, Ginger, for hosting. And by the way, Ginger's and her team created all of the awesome animation, creative flyers for the event. And they've been, you guys have done a great job hosting the videos. Ginger has been editing the videos. I just want to say thank you so much for all your time and volunteer work and everybody's volunteer work on this. I know I haven't seen a lot because we're all working from home and everything's behind the scenes, but I just can't thank you enough for you guys' help. So thank you.
And thank you, Lee, for putting this great series together.
Thank you, Ginger.
And also for those who are interested, we are on our come join us on our Discord channel or for our Pro Talk Watch Party or our live stream sketch meet, as well as our Q&A Tuesday every Tuesday, where we have a live stream with different guests and answer different questions as well too. So thank you.
Thank you. Good
Thank you,
night.
everybody. Good night.
Bye.